Really privileged to be here. Thanks very much for the opportunity to share God's word with you again this morning. A few weeks ago, that same verse, Luke 6, was my given subject. It was to be part of a 7-week series on love, and I gratefully accepted the invitation. And after a few days, I began to wonder why. Why was it that this was the only particular one in the series that was still on offer? And very soon, I began to understand. I'm not sure, whether I've ever really taken on board the enormity, I suppose, of what Jesus was actually telling his disciples to do. Or perhaps I hadn't really wanted to. Perhaps I hadn't wanted to understand by definition that it would be God's instruction to me too. And it didn't seem like a very grown-up Christian thing to do, to ask if I could change to an easier subject. So I began to prepare my talk, and as I did so, I became more and more conflicted by the message that God was asking his followers, and by extension for me, to do. And that was to love my enemies. And over the past weeks, to me, that hasn't got an awful lot easier. With the onslaught of saber rattling and threats of nuclear escalations, I've been desperately trying to square my circle, if you like, of how my reactions will be seen by God as loving my enemies. In any case, whatever my confliction, if that's a real word, as maybe want to share just a few thoughts with anyone that will listen. And that's where you come in this morning, I hope. As we just take a few minutes to look at our Bible reading, I believe we have a real conundrum to consider, somehow to make sense of, one that seems impossible really to reconcile with our old nature. Now, there'll be many of you good Bible students here that already be aware of all those Greek words for love, but this morning I just want to concentrate, perhaps on what is the most radical of all, and that's the agape love, the selfless love, the unconditional love, in fact, God's love. The one that C.S. Lewis referred to as gift love, the love that loves even when it's not reciprocated. The gift that is given that's neither accepted or returned. The love, we are told, that we must extend to all people, even to our enemies. Mark Twain, the author, once asked if he had a problem with all those bits of the Bible that he didn't understand. And his reply was, no, not at all. It's not the bits I don't understand I have the problem with, it's the bits that I do understand. And I'm sure you'll relate to that in some way. I do, certainly. What he was saying was, that some of Jesus' teachings are so difficult to live out in our daily lives that it's going to demand a radical change in our understanding, in our perspective, and more especially perhaps in our behaviour too. And here in Luke 6, this mini version of the Beatitudes, this Sermon on the Plain, we're confronted with that very same problem. For Jesus, in verse 27, commands us to love our enemies, do good to those who hate us, bless those who curse us, and pray for those who abuse and mistreat us. Whereas in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount records as, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. Okay, so far. But I tell you, he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It's not comfortable, is it? This is not comfortable stuff. There may be some question as to whether the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are indeed the same event, but it matters not. It matters not a jot. These are not in any way conflicting messages, are they? There's no doubt about the message that Jesus is giving to his disciples and to us. It's the same message. It's perfectly clear to understand, and the only problem we have, it seems, is with us. with our ability to put it into practice, to be able to put off our old nature and embrace that new teaching. I believe that this tough teaching is possibly the hardest part of the Christian life to truthfully live out. We don't normally have a problem with loving our friends or our families. I know misunderstandings occur from time to time, and broken relations I know are common enough. But how on earth are we expected to love those people who deeply hurt us and perhaps undermine us, whether that was in the past or whether it's right now today? I don't know. Imagine, if you can, what it is like to have been betrayed or have been abused in a way that has completely rocked your life. What about our brothers and sisters around the world being persecuted for their faith? Some subjected to rape and torture simply because they want to worship God. How can they reorientate their thinking? How can they change their feelings? How are they expected to love their enemies? My prayer this morning is that I don't say anything to you that you might misinterpret. I don't want to say anything that's trite or shallow or might be misconstrued or might even in some way serve to try to minimise the pain that any one of you may be holding on to. And it is for that reason I just want to share a couple of little caveats with you, if I may. To love someone in the sense that Jesus means here and to like someone are two completely different concepts. It may be, as I say, that someone is treating you badly and the pain runs really deep. I don't know. And yet we're told that there is a way. There is a way for us to learn to love that person, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you will like them. And it doesn't really mean that you're going to necessarily want to let them back into your life on any meaningful scale, if you like. But Jesus explains that it is possible to love our enemies. Immediately after the Queen's state funeral, the Reverend Kate Botley was chatting to Alex Jones. I don't know whether any of you saw it. Many millions, I guess, were watching it. About how families would be united or can be united in grief on these funeral occasions. And she openly admitted to many, many instances where that was really actually quite the opposite. How she'd been called up to act as a referee almost, an intermediary, where families were in conflict on that very day. And she said the same thing. She said, you don't have to like them. You don't have to go on holiday with them or even necessarily spend time with them. But on days like these, she said, you have to walk side by side with them and remember the one that you love. And if I get time, I'll come back to that a bit later. And the second proviso is that actually coming to a position or a place of being able to love our enemies is a journey. And that journey, more often than not, takes time. Sometimes it takes a lot of time. Sometimes it even takes a lifetime. But blessedly, God in his great mercy for us isn't expecting all of us to leave here this morning loving all the folks that might have hurt us in the past. But it will be a blessing to you, and it will be a blessing to them too, if you can take a few just faltering steps on your journey to love them, or even simply recognise your need to do that, to start the forgiveness, that journey of forgiveness and love. And if we can do any part of that, I believe today, that will be enough. That will be enough for today. Do good to those who hate you. We would do well, I think, sometimes to just allow Scripture just to sink into us a bit. I know I read it quite quickly sometimes, and I don't let it immerse me, if you like, or I don't immerse myself in it enough. Do good to those who hate you. I can imagine that when those words were said, they sounded just as outrageous all those years ago as it does this morning. I mean, it flies in the face of human nature, doesn't it? We've always loved our neighbours and hated our enemies. I have to say, even in church communities, we hate what they do. We hate their ideas. We hate what they stand for sometimes. And in the end, we inevitably, the final embodiment of all of that is that we can hate the people themselves. And as a society, we've become really, really good at the blame game. It's the Chinese, it's the Russians, it's the Iranians, the Tories, it's the Labour, it's the Lib Dems or whatever. We've become so well versed in holding other people responsible for all the ills in our own society. And then we become polarised, and those groups become a target for our hate. And barrelling into the midst of all of that comes Jesus, the one who offers this radical teaching that challenges us on such a deeply profound and, I have to say, for myself, uncomfortable level. Do good to those who hate you. Jesus is telling us that we mustn't ever seek revenge or try to hurt them back, but that we are to do good wherever we can to them. The truth is, and I think we all know it really, that anger and hatred towards anyone just serves to eat us up, both physically and emotionally. We become stressed, we become anxious, we make bad decisions, and perhaps the very worst of all, is that we can become spiritually disconnected from God himself, and consequently from forgiveness and love. And the truth is that revenge is not sweet. We have never ever been liberated by it. And in fact, the negativity of it all has just serves to imprison and destroy us too. And the only way to be free, if you like, of the weight of all of that negativity is to step out on that journey to do good to that person. You see, how that person feels about you isn't your responsibility. And it isn't within your control, is it? But what we can do, we can control the way that we respond to them, and that's not easy. As I've said before, that is a journey. Verse 28 goes on to remind us to bless those who curse you. Well, if revenge is sweet is a lie, then sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me is another. Actually, bones broken by sticks and stones tend to heal pretty quickly, really, blessedly. But folks, can be destroyed by unkind words and things that are said, harsh words. And I believe, and I'm sure you do too, if there's one thing that the world needs from a church today, from you and me, is a community of kindness and caring and forgiveness. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that I've brought this message to you that you have a problem, that we have a problem at all. Not at all. I just know in my heart that all Christian fellowships need that, to be careful. They need to be places where only kind words are spoken, where encouragement and healing and the witness and the outreach of God's church here, that's what they need, that's what they require, that's what they would love to have. Places where people can come and not be judged, where gossip and sarcasm and unkindness are just as alien to us as they are to our Lord, where words only bring healing and peace. I don't know whether this story is true, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. It's a story of a lady who, like so many other folks in the place where she lived, kept chickens in her garden, and one day 2 of them escaped into the next door's garden. I guess some have already heard it. Now, the neighbour became very agitated, apparently, at this avian invasion into his space. So angry, in fact, that he chased the chickens around the garden, grabbed both of them, wrung their necks and threw them over the fence. Now, I'm absolutely sure, there's a lot aghast at that. I'm sure it doesn't sound anything like any of us, does it? Not really. I mean, nobody here this morning would do anything like that. But I have to confess to throwing pebbles at the cat that defecated in my garden some time ago. Was that seen by my neighbours? I do hope not. I suppose that dear lady could have flown into a rage. She could have gone round and had a terrible argument with the man, but instead she takes the 2 dead chickens, she makes 2 pies, she takes it round to one of the pies round to him and apologised for not keeping her chickens under control. And the man was so surprised by the lady's kindness that he gave her a heartfelt apology for his overreaction, and they were both reconciled to one another. Isn't that a lovely story? I do like a happy ending, don't you? It's great. It's a great story. Of course, our story, our challenge to do good to those who curse us will be different. So what of our response? Will it demonstrate the likeness of our Lord Jesus, who said to do good to those who curse us? In truth, I guess there have been many moments in my life, and maybe in yours too, when we might have been much, much more comfortable interpreting the old Levitical laws as the lawyer did, I don't know whether you remember, and restricting our forgiveness and goodness to only those who we consider to be our neighbours. You remember the story there. That we somehow might justify our actions by only including our little inner circle of those who should receive our agape love. It's a question we all have to ask ourselves, isn't it? Who do we define as our neighbour? Who is worthy of our love? Jesus tells them the story of the Good Samaritan to close up that loophole that restricted their love to only those pious folks in the Jewish communities. It excluded the Samaritans and just about anyone else that wasn't as like-minded to them. I believe this morning Jesus speaks to each one of us to remind us that there is no room left to draw a little circle around those who we consider to be our neighbours and our friends. And so with that in mind, and just to complete our thoughts this morning, I just want to look at Matthew 43 and 44, where Jesus tells us to pray for those who abuse us and persecute us. Well, I know that prayer is a wonderful thing. It's a tool, I suppose, in the toolbox that none of us always use as much as we should do. I know I don't. But prayer can prevent us, from being inwardly destroyed by unkindness. Am I prepared to put aside the bitterness and the anger? Am I prepared to pray for those people, to name them before God, and to begin the process? For that's what it is. It's a process of freeing myself from the hold of all the negativity in my life. Prayer is a wonderful thing, a gift that allows us all to bring these things to God so that He, as Richard said this morning, He can start that healing process in us. And I love that old hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. It contains these lines as I close. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear, all because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. And in the last verse, my friends, it says, do thy friends despise, forsake thee? Take it to the Lord in prayer. In his arms he'll take and shield thee. Thou wilt find a solace there. And that's the truth. Our solace is always and only ever found in him. It is tough teaching, but the practice of loving our enemies is at the very, very heart of our Christian faith, isn't it? David read those words to us this morning. If you love those who love you, well, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And it goes on. It's not easy. It demands a whole new perspective on life. It demands a new way of behaving. And it demands that we ask ourselves some very difficult and awkward questions about ourselves. But ultimately, we all know that Jesus is right. We know that he lived out God's will on earth. And we know that Jesus did do good to those that hurt him. And that he did bless those that cursed him. And he did pray for those that abused him. And he calls us to go and do likewise. And as we learn to love our enemies, there will never ever be any greater demonstration of our Christian faith in society. And there will never be any greater demonstration of God at work in our lives. When we love our enemies, we shall truly be living out the image of God to his glory. Let's just pray.